The nu metal era was without doubt one of the most unique and interesting aspects of the evolution of metal music. It contributed greatly to the death of grunge, particularly after the mid-90s with the passing of Kurt Cobain. Korn, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot and Deftones are often cited as the main players during this time, although there are of course arguments for Slipknot and Deftones, especially as to whether they were indeed nu metal or not. Then we have more of what you could call a subset of nu metal artists that lurked in the underground. American Head Charge, Coal Chamber, Static X, and Godhead. They had somewhat of a more industrial and experimental edge to their sound. One group of musicians hailing from Illinois, however, would combine musical experimentation with one of the strangest looks of the era. Their face paint, costumes, and abstract music videos set them apart from the more commercially appealing imagery of, say, Korn, donning Adidas tracksuits and cruising around in Ferraris. And their debut record, LD50, would be certified gold in America on August 17th, 2001, essentially the height of the nu metal era. The record received praise from almost every prominent music magazine of the time, and their music video Dig would receive heavy rotation on music TV stations across the USA, Europe, and the UK. However, they didn't quite reach the level of global fame their nu metal peers did. So just exactly what happened to them? This is Death Blooms, the story of Mudvayne.
They're ready to see it, but the best thing really about this whole thing is that they put Jack Daniels and Coke in the can all together mixed. So yeah, Red Bull and Jack Daniels in these cans would be awesome.
1996, Mudvayne form with Greg on guitar and lead vocals, Sean Barkley on bass, and Matthew on drums. Sean would quickly be replaced by Ryan as bass player, and Chad Gray would be added on lead vocal duties. Sean Barkley, though, was the original member that put the band together, but for some reason left less than a year into Mudvayne, and Chad had absolutely no experience writing music or lyrics. I had never written original music before in my life, so it was my first stab at that. But I grew up with music. When I was a little kid, actual rock music was being played on the radio. The Eagles, Bob Seger, Frampton. Name any of those old school quintessential classic rock bands, that's where I got my first taste. My grandparents were really into hoedown music, barn dances, and square dancing, so there was also that. The Eagles, obviously one of the biggest rock bands from the 70s, Hotel California being the classic that everyone knows. And then Bob Seger with hits like Old Time Rock and Roll, released in 1978. Not exactly the kind of influence you can hear in Mudvayne's music, but an influence nonetheless. And if you're wondering, this is what hoedown music sounds like. From around 1997, this would be the definitive lineup of Mudvayne that would last up until 2010, without changing a single member for roughly 13 years. Despite becoming part of the nu metal scene, Mudvayne decided to describe their music as math metal due to their interest in experimental time signatures. But it would later come out that this was simply a joke made by the band, and their image came from a fascination with aliens. We always had this undercurrent fascination with the idea of aliens, alien culture, alien intelligence, kind of hinting at something otherworldly and beyond ourselves. This is definitely something that helped set Mudvayne apart from an aesthetic point of view, although we already had bands such as Slipknot and Mr. Bungle wearing strange masks. There was something incredibly eerie about Mudvayne's overall image. Mudvayne wasted no time in spreading their alien-influenced concept, and in 1997 they released their first EP without a record label called Kill Iota. And it was interesting to say the least. The first track was titled Poop Loser. It featured a crying baby and Chad Gray repeating one phrase to a drum beat. Although the production of the EP was fairly decent, it didn't quite have that Mudvayne sound that came with their debut record, Aldi 50, released August 22nd, 2000. During the same year, they would play shows with Ozzy Osbourne and Head PE, as well as landing a slot on Tattoo the Earth tour with Slayer, Sepultura, Hatebreed, and others. We do have a level of prog to us, and there were definitely some progressive elements, but I think that kind of stopped with the band, because what I brought to it was more, I felt like I had more of that nu metal-y vocal delivery. Greg was into it too. We were into nu metal. Obviously, Greg and I are inspired by the Metallicas, the Slayers, the Panteras of the world, but we were also very much inspired by Korn, the first album by Korn, Deftones, and early Machine Head. Greg and I were inspired by a lot of music that came to be known as nu metal, and I feel that's kind of what I brought to the table, those inspirations. However, it would be a connection with Slipknot that would really push Mudvayne into the spotlight. Founding Slipknot member Sean Cran, known as Clown, was a key catalyst here. Whilst he is credited as an executive producer on Aldi 50, he actually had no involvement with the record itself. What he did do though was help Mudvayne to get all of the tour slots they were playing. Just 1 year after its release via Epic Records, Aldi 50 would go gold on August 17th, 2001. And whilst Mudvayne seemed to put a lot of thought into the title and lyrics of the record, most of it was lost on the general public and even their fans. The name itself, Aldi 50, was a reference to a medical term. In toxicology, the median lethal dose, Aldi 50, is a toxic unit that measures the lethal dose of a given substance. The value of Aldi 50 for a substance is the dose required to kill half the members of a tested population after a specified test duration. A concept designed by John William Trevan, a British pharmacologist born in 1887. Then we have the opening track of Aldi 50, Monolith, which was inspired by the monolith in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The overall theme of the album reflects and embodies ideas about the evolution of consciousness, transformation, and the risks involved in experimenting with things that can change a person's point of view, internally and externally. The metaphor is that the things that can potentially open your mind, expand your consciousness, and show you a new version of yourself and the world also have a risk involved in them and a consequence. It's about how far you can push the envelope before it gets dangerous, which is a way we'd like to see our work perceived as well. When their music video Dig was released, most people only focused on one thing, and that was how Mudvayne looked and sounded, as opposed to the complex and somewhat profound topics they wanted to address lyrically and artistically. Aldi 50 also features distorted soundbites from Terence McKenna, an American ethnobotanist and mystic who advocated for the responsible use of naturally occurring psychedelic plants. The album itself peaked at number 85 on the Billboard charts, and Mudvayne also saw chart success with singles Dig and Death Blooms. We saw the album as our token little drug. People can ingest it, take it in, and grow from it. We endeared ourselves to the idea that our music and the things we as individuals seek to experience, and hopefully positively grow from, could potentially be destructive. There are some elements in what we do which could be thought of as dangerous, but you've got to be willing to take some risks and face your fears. This was a much more profound artistic expression than the weird-looking guys in face paint that everyone saw on MTV2 back in the early 2000s. There was clearly a lot more depth to be explored in Mudvayne's music, yet people continued to focus on this one video, a video that won the first ever MTV2 award at the 2001 Video Music Awards. So with all of this early attention, tour support from some big name bands, and a gold record in 2001, a year easily considered to be part of the nu metal explosion, how did Mudvayne fail to achieve the same global success as Slipknot, Korn, or even Limp Bizkit? November 19th, 2002, Mudvayne released their second studio album, The End of All Things to Come. By this point in metal history, nu metal had already seen some of the biggest records of the era hit the charts. Follow the Leader by Korn in 1998, Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park in 2000, Iowa by Slipknot in 2001, and of course we have bands such as Deftones, Static X, Limp Bizkit, and even Incubus, all contributing to the explosion of this genre. A year before this record, Mudvayne were one of the highlights of the 2001 MTV Video Music Awards, with their music video for Dig winning the first MTV2 award, presented to them by Gwen Stefani and Moby of all people. This was quite a monumental achievement considering all of the other bands within the nu metal scene at the time, and they shocked the world with their rather unique outfits.
Be horrible. Be honest.
I don't feel it's an artist's responsibility to be concerned with the impact they have on society. A lot of people might find that statement threatening or even rude, but it's an artist's main responsibility to be honest. I will guarantee that I will always check my intentions in the work that I do. If my intentions are positive, then the outcome or the impact of the work can only follow suit. If I'm misinterpreted or misunderstood, I can't be bothered by it. Trying to control the way people perceive you is ridiculous. It can't be done. Whilst they did decide to wear suits, they also had bullet wounds in their heads. FX makeup, of course, but still very unconventional for an award ceremony. MTV themselves decided to run an entire segment on their appearance.
I think they know it's Halloween and everybody else at the VMAs doesn't realize that it's Halloween.
However, by this point in time, Marilyn Manson was one of the biggest alternative rock stars, so Mudvayne having fake bullet holes in their heads really shouldn't have been such a big deal. When their second album, The End of All Things to Come, was released a year later, it debuted on the Billboard charts at number 17 and stayed in the charts for 41 weeks. So it seemed as if Mudvayne were indeed on the road to nu metal stardom.
Pride, let's fuck this shit up.
In 2001, they had also played well over 100 shows, so it was safe to say they'd built up a following. In 2005, Mudvayne would see their biggest chart position for any album they've ever released, Lost and Found. Released on April the 12th, 2005. It would enter the Billboard charts at number 2, losing the number 1 spot to Mariah Carey. The record would stay on the chart for over 20 weeks and also chart in Germany, Canada, Australia, Sweden, and the UK. This was the band on the verge of taking over the world, but despite the success, cracks started to appear. Fans were seemingly none the wiser, and little did they know that Mudvayne would soon come to an abrupt halt. It's actually quite difficult to fully know the truth behind any of the reasons for Mudvayne's slow descent into collapse, but looking at some old interviews, it's possible to get a glimpse into the very secretive world of the band. In an interview with MTV in 2005, Chad Gray may have hinted at one of the most common reasons as to why bands fall apart: spending weeks or even months together on a tour bus, constantly in each other's faces, usually where alcohol and substances can often be involved, has always been a recipe for disaster. Dude, can I get like 1 fucking minute to myself? I mean, Greg is back here on the bus, Ryan is back here on the bus, Matt is back here in the bunk area. Jesus. sorry, they're like my brothers, sometimes we get pissed off at each other. Sometimes we can't stand each other, but at the end of the day, we'll apologize and move on because we don't have a choice. I depend on these guys more than anyone else in my life. This is a stronger bond than most families have. But as we all know, no matter how strong a family bond is, that sometimes isn't enough to hold them together. And drummer Matthew also hinted at the personal struggles musicians can face when they're on the road 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm a private person generally. When I'm home, I'm very much in need of my own space. Being on tour is a complete freak out. Sometimes I'll crawl into my bunk, close the curtain, and sit there, just to be in a space where I'm alone. I think it's important to desensitize yourself in order to retain balance, to limit the amount of stimulus from the people around you. When I'm constantly surrounded, I don't always know how best to handle it, so I regularly make a habit of getting lost. In a more recent interview with Chad in 2023, he spoke about his struggles with alcohol over the years. I was insane, I was a madman, I drank and I was volatile, and I was crazy and not a great drinker. I was just an asshole. It was just crazy, period. And I just got fed up with that dude. I quit to try to help myself and to be a better me and to live a better life. And it just doesn't work that way. You want to think that you stop doing shit like that and all the voices get quiet. And it's like, dude, they're screaming. And everything becomes more amplified. All the feelings, all the emotions, all the depression, all the fucking shit, you know. So it seems that some members of Mudvayne may well have gone through bouts of depression and clearly developed some addictions during the course of their career, maybe even before, which is pretty common for a lot of bands from this era. Another interview from 2023, Chad also spoke to Johnny Christ, bass player for California's very own Avenged Sevenfold, on his podcast, Drinks with Johnny, and he made the following statement. There was a lot of bad blood, a lot of crazy shit that went down with Mudvayne. We were in a litigation for years. That was super emotional and obviously very costly. Everything just kind of imploded, and it wasn't anybody in the band's fault. In 2008, MTV reported that certain bands from the nu metal era were embroiled in a lawsuit with a fan that had been severely injured at a concert. Korn and Mudvayne were both named in a lawsuit filed in the same year in Denver District Court. According to a Rocky Mountain News report, the show was Nicole Lascalia's first concert experience. She ended up leaving the event in an ambulance after one of her legs was crushed by the weight of the crowd. She is seeking unspecified damages, and her case is likely to proceed slowly, to allow time for the numerous parties involved to respond to its claims. The fan underwent surgery that allegedly cost around $60,000 US, and the lawsuit was to seek compensation for medical bills along with damages for severe pain and suffering. It was also around this time that Mudvayne physically started to separate. Greg and Chad had joined a supergroup with none other than the late great Vinnie Paul of Pantera. This supergroup also featured Nothing Face guitarist Tom Maxwell. This band would be called Hell Yeah. Their self-titled debut record was released in 2007 and debuted at number 9 on the Billboard charts, selling close to 50,000 copies in its first week. Now, for any band to see that type of success with a debut album is quite naturally a very positive start. But with an ongoing lawsuit, tensions between members of Mudvayne seemingly in play, it must have come as quite a breath of fresh air to Chad and Greg. This is also where we see a drastic change in touring schedules. 2006 had seen Mudvayne play around 50 shows, and in 2007, they would only play one show, whereas Hell Yeah would rack up over 120 concerts in that same year. It certainly does appear as if the introduction of Hell Yeah was a very dominating factor to the gradual decline of Mudvayne. And we also don't know how long the lawsuit went on for or how much it actually ended up costing the band. So this could have been a major factor also. However, by 2010, Mudvayne had officially gone on hiatus, and this was due to Hallier's touring and album release commitments. I think that what we did is valuable. It's become a cog in the wheel of music in some sort of way. We are a piece of musical history now. We were always just responding to our environment. I always saw the band to be important as an aspect of my life, as something that was supposed to take us places that are positive. And in that sense, everything that happened with the band has happened for a reason. Mudvayne were very specifically linked to the nu metal era, and that genre was essentially dead by 2006. The bands of this time either started to experiment with other genres to survive, or they faded back into the underground, although that in itself is a much more complex topic. Mudvayne were seen by many as innovators, but it seemed the lifestyle and pressure of a declining genre became too much to keep going. Whilst they did indeed reform in 2021, fans are still patiently waiting on news of new music. But I guess that depends on whether or not the band is now truly happy.